Thank you all for being here for today's event, where we're going to be discussing Apple's proposed CSAM policy and a bunch of other fun questions that are related to that new tech. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our wonderful panel today, starting with Laura Draper. She is a senior project director at the Washington College of Law's Tech Law and Security program, where she manages research focused on identifying the tools, best practices, and legal and policy options available to tech companies and law enforcement as they combat online child sexual exploitation. Prior to joining the College of Law, she served as an assistant general counsel with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and as a judicial clerk in the Southern District of New York. She also previously worked at the Council of State Governments Justice Center, where she focused on law enforcement matters. She earned her BA from Case Western Reserve University, an MS from University of Pennsylvania, a master's in philosophy from Cambridge University, and a JD from NYU School of Law. We also today have John Verdi, who is the Senior Vice President of Policy at the Future of Privacy Forum, where he supervises the organization's extensive policy portfolio on a broad range of issues, including artificial intelligence and machine learning, algorithmic decision-making, ethics, the Internet of Things, de-identification, and so many more other policies. John previously served as the Director of Privacy Initiatives at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, where he crafted policy recommendations for the US Department of Commerce and President Obama regarding technology, trust, and innovation. Prior to his work, he was also general counsel for the Electronic Privacy Information Center, also known as EPIC, overseeing their litigation program. He earned his BA in philosophy, politics, and law from SUNY Binghamton and a JD from Harvard Law School. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Hany Farid, who is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, with a joint appointment in the Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences and the School of Information. He previously served as the dean and head of school for the UC Berkeley School of Information. Dr. Farid's research focuses on digital forensics, forensic science, misinformation, image analysis, and human perception. And he has consulted for various intelligence agencies, courts, news organizations, and scientific journals seeking to authenticate the validity of images. He's also the recipient of the prestigious Sloan Fellowship and Guggenheim Fellowship for his work in the field, as well as a lifetime fellow of the National Academy of Inventors. He earned his undergraduate in computer science and applied mathematics from the University of Rochester and a PhD in computer science from the University of Pennsylvania. So thank you to all of our wonderful panelists who are here today. As a kind of intro into what we're going to talk about today, in August, Apple announced a planned suite of new child safety features, including scanning users' iCloud photo libraries for child sexual abuse material, also known as CSAM, their communication safety feature to warn children and their parents when receiving or sending sexually explicit photos, and expanded CSAM guidance in Siri and search. Following their announcement, these features were criticized by a wide range of individuals and organizations, including security and privacy researchers, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, also known as EFF, politicians, various policy groups, and even some Apple employees themselves. The majority of this criticism was leveled at Apple's planned on-device CSAM detection, claiming that it was dangerous technology that bordered on surveillance and in itself ineffective at identifying images of sexual abuse. So Apple actually went ahead with the communication safety feature in their messages, which went live in December of last year, but Apple actually decided to delay the rollout of the other detection tech. But they have stated that they still intend to move forward with their detection technology. They're just taking some time to gather information and sort of think about that feedback from everybody who had comments and concerns. So to start us off, Laura, could you give us a little bit of background information on what it is that we call CSAM?
Sure. So I think of CSAM as actually a subpart of a larger conversation around online child sexual abuse and exploitation. So to the extent that that is our umbrella term, there is within that three primary patterns, which are neither mutually exclusive nor exhaustive. The first of those is what we traditionally think of as when we think about this issue, which is a child is abused in real life images are taken of that abuse and uploaded to the internet and then shared among like-minded individuals. Those images are referred to as CSAM, child sexual abuse material. In the US criminal code, they are also referred to as child pornography. Most people who work in this space prefer this term CSAM because children cannot consent to their own abuse. And so CSAM better captures the gravity of the situation. So that's our first kind of pattern of behavior. The second I would refer to as perceived self-generated content. So that's children, that is people under the age of 18, who take photos of themselves in sexually compromised or explicit ways. Those images are then shared knowingly or unknowingly by the child. And in some instances, they can then be the basis of sextortion, which is where the recipient extorts the person who created the images in the first place to produce increasingly explicit images under threat of public release of those images. The third category of online child sexual abuse and exploitation that I think of is internet facilitated prostitution of children, which follows what we would typically think of as the pattern of prostitution of children, but that is aided by the internet in some way or fashion through either communication technology or through online advertisements and other things of that sort. So those are really the three primary patterns. Of course, there's overlap. They're not exhaustive. There are things I've not mentioned, but so we can think about both the umbrella and then more narrowly into CSAM.
Great, thank you so much for that overview. I think obviously we have Hany on the panel today, who perhaps is our technical expert here with all those computer science degrees. And so maybe you could start us off and kind of get us going on thinking how effective would Apple's proposed photo checking text strategy really be, given the current use of this technology to distribute the content, as Laura had mentioned.
Good, thank you, Divya. So if we acknowledge that we would like to develop and deploy technology to limit the spread of this. So let's put aside the privacy argument and all the arguments that I'm sure we will be having. Just put that aside for a minute. There's sort of two problems, if you will, that you could try to address. One is, for every image, every video that is uploaded or sent, try to determine if there's a child in the image or video, if it's sexually explicit, and if the child is underage. That's a really, really hard problem. Even with all of the advances of today, of machine learning and AI, the technology is not there to work with the accuracy and speed to analyze literally billions of images and video a day. So we don't have that artificial intelligence ability to reason about the underlying content the way our human visual system is capable of doing. Now, another way to think about this problem, and for this, I have to explain one thing that you should understand about CSAM, which Laura did a very nice job of giving us some scaffolding to think about, is that the same content is distributed year after year and decade after decade. So once the content is created, the original exploitation of a child, and that exploitation is recorded, that content lives on for, in many cases, decades. And in many cases, that image is at some point identified by law enforcement, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the Canadian Center for Child Protection, Interpol, whoever it is. And so a different way to think about this problem of limiting the spread of CSAM is to say, we have previously identified these pieces of material. Today at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, that number is in the tens of millions. And we are going to limit the spread, the redistribution. So for content that is newly created, that we have not previously seen, we will be blind to it. But the reason we think about this problem is that technically, that problem is a little bit easier, because I'm handing you an image or a video and I'm saying, this has been identified as a child underage. And we know it is sexually explicit. We know it's categorized as CSAM. We would like to stop the redistribution. And that's the category that we are talking with the Apple technology and PhotoDNA, which is the technology I worked on with Microsoft many years ago. A couple of things I want to say about this. So one is, it is technically feasible. We can scan images with very, very high accuracy and very, very high efficiency to determine if it is previously identified CSAM. And I think the most important thing to understand here is that when we developed PhotoDNA, which is this type of technology for stopping redistribution, it was never meant to be a law enforcement effort. It was a victim-centric technology, because if you talk to the children who were abused, what they will tell you is that was probably the worst day of their life. But what they'll also tell you is day in and day out, knowing that the images and the video of their abuse being shared online is horrific for them. And so if we can disrupt that global distribution of past abuses, it is very much in the interest of the children and in their interest and in their privacy as well. And so very briefly, the way the technology works is it extracts from a piece of content, an image or a video, a distinct digital signature, and it tries to match that signature on upload. That's how PhotoDNA worked. That's the core of the way Apple did it. Apple had some nice features that were more privacy preserving, which ironically got them in trouble with the privacy groups, even though it was the more privacy preserving technology than PhotoDNA, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in more detail. And the last thing I'll say about this is that this technology is very similar to other types of cybersecurity technology. Every time you send an email, every attachment is compared against a signature of malware, viruses, spam filtering. Every time you upload a file, those are scanned against known harmful content. So that mechanism, that scaffolding that Apple is using, that we have used in the past, sort of already exists in cybersecurity. We're not really getting very far out of accepted best practices. Now, how effective is it? It's a great question. Is it going to stop the abuse of children? No, of course not. Does it protect children? Absolutely. Just to give you an idea, last year alone, in 1 year, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, their cyber tip line, received 20 million reports of CSAM, the vast majority of which were done with PhotoDNA, this type of technology that we're talking about. That's 20 million images of kids being abused that did not get distributed. Does that solve the problem in its entirety? Of course not, but nothing is going to solve the problem in its entirety. The way you solve this problem is you chip away at it, and I consider this type of technology the absolute bare minimum that we should be doing to protect children online and to protect their privacy.
Thank you so much for that. I will say before I move on that I had meant to mention this in the beginning, but if you do have any questions for our panelists, please be sure to write them in the Q&A section, and we'll definitely have time at the end of the panel to have our panelists answer your questions. So building off of what you've said, obviously you've mentioned that privacy advocates have had issues with what Apple has put forth. There was this idea that Apple would integrate privacy features, but of course, perhaps not to the liking or to the level that privacy advocates would like. And so I'm going to ask now, John, is there really valid concern about the privacy of people's personal sensitive photos with the tech and that Apple has proposed?
Sure. So let me first say that my views on this matter are probably more aligned with my fellow panelists than some others in the privacy community. And I very much appreciate the history on PhotoDNA, and I appreciate the context here. I'm actually sort of glancing down at my notes, and my colleagues here have made some of the points that I was actually going to tee up to sort of frame this technology. So thank you so much for doing that. That gives me the fun part, right, where I can delve into the controversy. So let me say this. The concerns that have been expressed by cybersecurity experts and privacy experts about Apple's proposed technology are no doubt real. The question, in my view, and I hope we can drill down on this, is whether or not those concerns are greater, equal to, or less than alternative models that are used by industry every day today, not by Apple, but by others in industry, other big players, right? Communications companies, cloud storage companies, et cetera, in order to detect and mitigate this terrible material. And I think that's a really robust conversation that I would love to have. So in order to perhaps tee up some of that conversation, let me just flag a couple of things. I appreciate the kind introductions. The one thing that I have in my notes that we have not covered so far is the legal status of this material. And I think it probably goes without saying for my colleagues up here, but I just want to flag it for attendees and for anybody who's watching us on recording. CSAM material is unique when it comes to moderation and law enforcement and the desire of platforms to have this material off of their servers. Unlike other material, even other unlawful material, CSAM material is in many jurisdictions a strict liability offense. That is, no intent is required in order to prosecute. There are regional differences, but anyone who would say that the legal status of CSAM is equivalent to the legal status of, say, material that infringes copyright does not understand this issue, right? Intent matters when it comes to copyright infringement. Fair use analysis matters when it comes to copyright infringement. Commercial versus non-commercial use matters when it comes to copyright infringement. There's lots of different things that matter there. CSAM material is illegal to possess. It's illegal to create. It's illegal to distribute. It's illegal, full stop. And there are lots of good reasons beyond the legal reasons for why platforms want this stuff off their systems. So if you're a platform, you have a few choices. You can do nothing, which virtually assures that your platform will become a haven for this unlawful and terrible material. You can scan content on your platform, which is effective to some degree, as my colleagues have described, but necessarily requires that you as the platform developer and owner have access to all that material on your platform in the clear. Or, and this is the novelty of Apple's approach, you can do pre-upload comparison, much in the way that services do pre-upload comparison for malware, for hacked data, right? Data that has been released, that has been made publicly available in a data breach, and others try to upload and distribute on cloud platforms. There are pre-upload checks for that. Some do pre-upload checks for copyrighted material. Some do pre-upload checks for material that is not technically speaking malware, but can be problematic, such as Bitcoin mining software or crypto mining software that can take up a lot of computer cycles and a lot of energy, and it's against terms of service, right? So this kind of pre-upload matching that Apple has developed poses different questions from the privacy community than on-platform scanning does. And in order to tee up what I think is the really interesting discussion here of how does this compare to other approaches or to doing nothing, I think it's important to appreciate that the critiques from the cybersecurity community and the privacy community have, in my view, largely fallen into two buckets. One bucket is Apple's approach to pre-upload matching of CSAM vulnerable to abuse by governments or other bad actors who would like to turn this tool into something for which it was never intended, and instead use it to try to identify other sorts of images, non-CSAM images. That's one bucket of concerns. Is the actual Apple approach and technical implementation vulnerable to attack if you're a cybersecurity professional? The second bucket of critiques has been more of a legal and policy and global political critique. And that has been, this is essentially the first instance of pre-upload matching on Apple devices for photo storage. And will this encourage governments around the world, law enforcement agencies, corporations, individuals, whomever, to press for increased surveillance and pre-upload scanning and matching regarding other material? Not a technical attack on the Apple implementation, but a legal either requirement or request or incentives to expand this beyond CSAM. Those are, in my view, the two buckets of critiques. And those are the concerns that were expressed by cybersecurity professionals, by privacy professionals. And I will say that the manner in which Apple rolled out this feature, regardless of the substance of the feature, right, perhaps could have benefited from pre-rollout vetting by independent security professionals. There was, I want to be clear, there was some pre-rollout vetting by select experts. But I think a broader vetting might have made a difference in the reception, or perhaps not.
No, you bring up some great questions, one of which actually was one that I had myself for all of you to answer. And, I'm happy to hear also what our other panels have to say to John's questions. Specifically, I had the question, how, what the valid risk is of abuse by other countries where personal freedoms and civil liberties are really at high risk of persecution by the government. And so I open this up, to Laura and Hany to provide some insight as well.
Sure. So I would say, as to John's two questions, the first question being, is Apple's system as set up subject to abuse by other governments? And the second question is, does Apple's system open up to broader abuse, mandating other systems to have that kind of on-device scanning? So with respect to the first one, I actually think Apple has been quite clever and deliberate in how they've structured this. They require the scanning actually gets matched against databases of these CSAM fingerprints, so to speak, these hash values. And it has to have, in order to be a positive match, it has to hit against databases owned by and maintained by two sovereign jurisdictions. So that is to say that the United States could not make the decision to say that some terrorist video should be identified and rooted out. And so we hash it, put it in our database, and then put it in another one of the US's databases, and then we get two matches and it gets uploaded. It's two sovereign jurisdictions. So that itself actually is quite protective, I think, in a lot of ways, in terms of in the ways that governments could or could not manipulate the existing Apple system. Whether or not it opens the door as to the second question is a little bit of a stickier issue, I think, in some ways. But the first one, I think, like I said, I think Apple has actually been quite deliberate in ensuring that the way they structure it would be pretty protective in that sense and pretty resistant to abuse.
I'll just add a few things. I think John did a great job of laying the landscape of the concerns that people have. And I think John is absolutely right that there are legitimate concerns here. We should talk about them. So is it vulnerable to the so-called slippery slope? Well, if you do this, what are you going to do next? And, that argument I always find a little intellectually lazy, because you could say that about every technology. So for example, there is a microphone on my phone. There's a GPS tracking. Could that be abused? Of course. Do I know what's inside of the iOS, every line of code, how that information is being used? No. Could malware detection, spam detection, virus detection, any of number of cybersecurity technology be abused by companies, by hackers, or by repressive regimes? Of course. So if we're going to use the argument, could this technology be abused? We all need to throw away our phones and turn off our computers and unplug them, because all of the technologies can be abused. And so the question is not, can it be abused? And Laura did a nice job and did a good service for us, is explaining that Apple actually was very thoughtful and I would say they actually went too far in some cases. I think they actually made it too hard, but I appreciate why they did it. It's extremely privacy preserving. They put the safeguards in place. Is it perfect? Is it open to abuse? Of course. But then, as John was saying, we have to balance that. What are we talking about on the other side of that? And what we're talking about, and what we haven't mentioned, by the way, and I think it's worth mentioning without being too graphic, is that the average age of a child involved in CSAM is 8, down to a few months old. We are actually not talking about 15, 16, 17-year-olds who are playing with their sexuality. I'm not excusing that, don't get me wrong. We are talking about pre-verbal infants who are being sexually abused and their content being distributed online. And I say that because you have to put the risks and the concerns on balance with those issues of protecting the most vulnerable among us. And I would say this is, as I said earlier, the bare minimum technology. And I want to also emphasize that what I found really interesting about the pushback was Apple proposed to do the scanning on the device for images that were about to be uploaded to the cloud. And that's what made people crazy. If they had said, hey, we are going to scan images as they enter the cloud, people would have said, well, that sounds about right. Everything gets scanned when it enters into the cloud for all forms of abuse, as John enumerated. But doing that means you can't store things in an encrypted fashion. So to preserve user privacy, we are going to incorporate this technology on your device, which is the right thing to do for privacy preserving technology, but it is exactly what made the privacy groups extremely unhappy. And I think primarily, as John enumerated, because, well, what's next? And the thing that I have not found compelling is when you make a slippery slope argument, you have to ask at least two questions. One is it possible? And the answer is yes. And the other question is, what's the incentive? Like, what's the incentive for Apple to actually do something that is nefarious? And that is missing here. So I don't find those threats on balance outweighs the benefits of the technology to protect children online.
So can I add on to that very
Sure,
briefly?
Definitely, go ahead.
So I don't want to step on our kind moderator and friend. But can I just say, because you referenced development of PhotoDNA, and you've been at this for a while. I've worked in this space for a while too. And one thing that I think is helpful is to have an appreciation for the history of how these technologies have been implemented over time, how NCMEC has operated over time as a trusted repository of these hashes, right? And it's not just the technical controls that Apple has put in place. It's not just the process and policy controls in terms of human review that Apple has put in place. But when one talks about the risk in my second bucket, which I call the political and policy risk, and to be clear, I am very, very strongly supportive of strong encryption, end-to-end encryption technology, right? Go to my Twitter, check out the resources that the Future Privacy Forum produces. I am probably further over on being supportive of end-to-end encryption than a lot of people in the field for a lot of different reasons, right? But one thing that I think is helpful here to understand and appreciate is that we have decade plus experience of how NCMEC operates, how it partners with companies, how it interacts with law enforcement, right? How other similarly situated entities operate. And we have a decade plus of experience in terms of at least having a track record for whether or not steps to identify CSAM and mitigate and eliminate CSAM lead to government overreach in other content areas. There are a lot of negative stories to tell about privacy out there in the world, in the commercial space, in the law enforcement space, in the government space generally, in the US and around the world. But I don't consider overreach regarding CSAM mitigation to be one of those stories. We simply don't have a political track record for a decade plus of lawmakers and regulators and law enforcement agencies around the world successfully compelling global companies to expand their PhotoDNA efforts to include copyrighted material, politically objectionable material, other sorts of material that governments and law enforcement agencies and others around the world would love to curtail, right? We simply don't have a track record of successful attempts there. So when one talks about the slippery slope, I think it's important to ask, based on our knowledge about the world and the political process, how slippery is this particular slope? I am not here to tell you there is a 100% guarantee that implementation of this feature would not lead to renewed calls in legislatures and in regulatory bodies in the US and around the world for expanded scope. I am here to say that we have a track record on these issues, and it's not a track record of a year or 2 years. It's a track record of a significant period of time in which in my view, common sense mitigation of CSAM using PhotoDNA and other similar technologies has not led to that sort of overreach.
I don't know, Hany, if you have anything else to follow up with that.
I really appreciate that, John. I think you're absolutely right. And I'll just say, so PhotoDNA was developed by myself and Microsoft back in 2008. So John is right, it's over a decade now. And I will tell you, when we started deploying it in 2009, I heard almost verbatim the exact same objections that I'm hearing today with Apple's technology. This is going to lead to X, Y, Z. And that, as John said, has simply not been true. And I think we have to acknowledge that. John is absolutely right. Is it 100% guaranteed? No. But again, we have to balance what are we trying to do on the other side of that. And I think we put reasonable safeguards in when we develop and deploy PhotoDNA. I think Apple has done the same thing. I don't think anybody wants to overreach here, but I think that, we are in crisis mode about protecting children online. And I will say things have gotten much, much worse over the last 2 years through the pandemic. The number of child sexual abuse imagery that is being reported every year keeps going up. We now have live streaming of child abuse on platforms like Zoom and other types of video conferencing. And the problem is getting worse. And we have to acknowledge that some interventions are necessary. And the thing I'll say too is I'm always frustrated that, I've heard people say, well, it's fine to put technologies on my device to protect me, the user, malware, virus, spam, et cetera, but don't you dare put technology to protect other people. And I think that is awfully selfish. And we should acknowledge that, yes, we are giving up something. I think it's very, very small, but it's for a very, very good reason that we're doing that too.
Laura, I don't know if you have anything else to add here. Obviously, it's a very complicated debate.
It is very complicated. Just to Hany's last point, I think, the idea of these trade-offs, don't infringe my privacy even for the protection of children. I think one of the things that gets a little bit lost sometimes when we talk about privacy as this kind of monolith term, we're talking about the privacy of us, frankly, us on this panel, right? The law-abiding citizen, right? But the privacy interest that often gets overlooked and even lost in these conversations is the privacy interest of the abuse victim, of the child or who has been abused. And so they also have a privacy interest in not having their image of, as Hany said, the worst day of their life, most likely, continued to be circulated and distributed and shared. And so I think that also just needs to be incorporated into when we think about balancing these issues.
No, it's a valid point. Obviously, I think as everyone knows, once you're on the internet, you're on the internet. There is no removing that content once it's out there in the world. And so we have been talking about this sort of photo detection technology, and I want to pivot a little bit and also talk about the communication safety feature too that Apple has rolled out. And Laura, I know you do some research as well on end-to-end encryption and how that plays a role in this. And so I pose this question to you about, we have this constant debate about access to end-to-end encrypted messages. Is Apple's message check tech and strategy really a step in the right direction or the wrong direction?
So I think it's a step in the right direction. And I think that for a handful of reasons. First of all, I think end-to-end encryption is here to stay. I think we can have as many debates as we want about it, and law enforcement can scream from every top mountain and hill, and it just doesn't matter. End-to-end encryption is going to be a thing. And it's already here, and it's only going to become more prevalent, I think, across all of our platforms. So with that in mind, we have to come up with strategies and solutions that combat this issue at every way we can. We have to take every bite at the problem we can. As we talked about earlier, there's a whole range of harms that occur against children online in these contexts. And so we have to think about multiple strategies. There is no one fix to this problem. And so in thinking about this as well, just to give some numbers, Hany pointed out the cyber tip line that gets the reports received by NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. In 2020, there were over 21 million reports made to NCMEC. Facebook made over 20 million reports. Apple made 265. Not 1,000, 265. And so Apple needs to be and is taking this issue seriously. They are stepping up their work, and every bite that they can take at this apple is a step in the right direction. When we talk specifically about the iMessage issue, again, as Hany pointed out, with respect to the tech, when we think about the algorithms that have to identify this, all they're really doing right now is identifying nudity. And that's for technical reasons, I suspect, as much as anything else, in that it's easy to identify nudity. It's much harder for a machine to identify CSAM. And so I want to be sure that those two things don't get conflated. But within the realm specifically of in a space like iMessage, where it's end-to-end encrypted, you've got this machine learning to identify sensitive or explicit content. I think one of the things that's quite useful in this is that it doesn't actually prevent the sending or receipt of the material. All it does is prompt the user to say, are you sure you want to look at this? Are you sure you want to send this? Are you really sure that you want to send this? And that kind of like road bump, so to speak, is actually quite useful and provides the user with a great deal of agency about what they do and do not want to view. It is not going to stop the adversarial distribution of CSAM. It's not going to stop bad guy to bad guy distribution or sharing of content. It's not. But as we've talked about, this perceived self-generated material is very much on the rise, and having that kind of prompting to remind users that this image is going to be shared with somebody, I think can be a useful pause in the way young people and children think. The Internet Watch Foundation, which is a nonprofit based out of the UK, reported that, I believe in 2020 or 2021, 44% of the reported images they received involved self-generated content. So this is very much a big and growing problem. And the pandemic has, of course, certainly made it worse in many respects. So it is something, and again, so you're tackling a problem that really is at kind of the core and is growing. And I think anything we can do to chip away and minimize the harms that arise from this is a good thing. I would also just say that I would want to be sure that it is coupled with a couple things. I think, first of all, it has to be coupled with preventative education to children so that they understand what it means to be sending this content, these images of themselves, what the risks are. You know, is this really a person you trust? When we think about sextortion, Thorn, which is a nonprofit based here in the United States around online child safety issues, reports that about 60% of sextortion victims knew the offender in person, in real life, and about 40% of them met and only engaged on the internet. And so there really has to be a combination to say, you might know this person in real life. That doesn't mean that they're not at risk of doing something untoward with your image. And so that, and I also think it needs to be coupled with a safe and secure user reporting mechanism within the program, so that if somebody is receiving or being prompted to send images that make them uncomfortable, that they feel safe and secure reporting that to the platform or law enforcement or whomever, and that they understand that they have options.
Hany and John, if you have anything also to add. And I'll also say, you know, we've been waiting at the end for questions, but someone did ask, the 265 reports that were made from Apple, was that a result of the complaints made to Apple, or was it Apple doing anything proactive themselves?
So I would say, I'm not totally sure. I'm going to bet that it's based on user reporting as much as anything else, but the numbers are not broken down that way on the NCMEC site.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, John. No, please, John, go ahead.
I'm not going to speak for Apple either. I would say, just looking at the number, my analysis is the same as Laura's. It appears to be as a result of reporting and not as a result of scanning. I will say, and I'm not going to attribute it to a particular person, but folks who are in a position to know in industry, or folks who previously were in industry in very senior roles and are now in other roles outside, have essentially characterized the volume question on this in differences between platforms as largely based on the platform's willingness and volume of scanning, rather than a difference in volume on particular platforms, which was surprising to me, frankly. Other material, there are certain platforms that are particularly popular for posting music, and particularly popular for posting movies, and particularly popular for posting documents. And they don't always translate across platforms, right? One does not go to Bandcamp to find a Word document, right? You go to find audio. But what has been shared with me from people, again, who are in a position to know, is essentially that many platforms suffer from this problem and are actively combating it. And that when you see differences in reporting numbers, it typically has to do with the scope at which they are scanning rather than the actual prevalence on their platform. And that means that companies like Facebook, who scan a lot, end up in some circumstances getting criticized for reporting a lot, even though it's simply a result of them doing more scanning. Honey, I don't know if you have a view.
I think, John, you're absolutely right. And also we have to remember Facebook is Instagram, Facebook, and WhatsApp. And so that's a very, very big entity worldwide. And I think John is absolutely right. The more you look, the more you find. And that's what we've learned over the last decade. I'll add one thing. I want to come back to what you said, just so that John and I don't agree on everything. I want to come to the question about end-to-end. I'm not a firm believer in end-to-end, and here's why. First of all, in the offline world, there is nothing that is immune to a lawful warrant, right? My physical mail communication, my phone calls, my physical body, my office, my car, my home, my office, with a lawful warrant can all be searched. And there's a reason for that, right? There's a reason why we do that. And so I'm not entirely clear why we should have bulletproof end-to-end communication online that is immune to any type of security or lawful warrant access. I understand, don't get me wrong, that there are some bad people out there, there are bad governments, there's a need for privacy, and there's a need for secure communication. I absolutely understand that. But in the same breath, we have to acknowledge there are really bad people out there doing bad things within this end-to-end encrypted service, whether that is the sale of illegal drugs, which in the United States, opioid deaths last year topped 100,000. Vast majority of the dealing of those drugs is happening online. Child sexual abuse, terrorism and extremism, the sex trade. And so there are really bad things happening, and to create this bulletproof tunnel that allows us to do that, I'm not entirely sure that the benefits of that outweigh the drawbacks. And again, it's I see the benefits, I really do, but we have to acknowledge, and even Zuckerberg acknowledged, there is a threat if we deploy end-to-end encryption. And I'm not there yet. I'm not sure that I see the benefits outweighing the drawbacks. And I see what Apple did as a very thoughtful entryway into trying to respect and preserve the end-to-end encrypted messaging service while adding some protection. And maybe Laura is right, is that it is here to stay, and we just have to figure out how to manage it as opposed to trying to eliminate it. But I think I'm not, again, I just want to say, I think there's still a debate to be had as to whether the benefits are going to outweigh the drawbacks on whole.
John, do you care to respond?
Good. Now we disagree about
something. Now we're getting into it.
Now we're getting into it. So on end-to-end generally, I don't disagree with the global analysis that end-to-end has benefits and drawbacks. No question. What I do disagree with is whether or not this is a fait accompli and the game is already over. And I would say my view is that it is. End-to-end encrypted messaging, storage, et cetera, is technically trivial to develop. Criminals of all stripes will have it, whether governments around the world want them to or not. The only question is whether the rest of us, the non-criminals, and I'll assume for the sake of argument today that the panel and our guests are non-criminals, at least in a meaningful way. The question is whether or not we derive, and society overall derives the benefits from end-to-end encryption, because criminals will, whether we want them to or not.
Okay, so let me pose this. Here in the US, we have, I think, the world's largest number of handgun and gun deaths by a spectacular margin. And can I make the same argument here? Bad guys have guns, so let's give guns to everybody. What could possibly go wrong? So is that the same argument, John? By the way, I appreciate the argument. That's one of the more thoughtful arguments, but is that the same argument? Well, bad guys have guns, well, then I want guns too.
If guns could be independently manufactured and developed by a smart undergraduate student in a weekend in their dorm room, maybe.
I see. You're saying, yeah, although 3D printing of guns is sort of getting us there, but I don't think we're quite there yet.
But genuinely, I
see what you're
saying.
This
is a principled position that I believe that the facts about the world are that the underlying math and the underlying software implementations are out there and exist. And if you ask me the question, hey, we have a lot of bow and arrow deaths here in the United States, which I'm not comparing to guns in a meaningful way, but a bow and arrow is very simple to create oneself, right? Ought we regulate bow and arrows when someone can simply go into their backyard and take down a sapling and create a bow and create an arrow? Yeah, I'm happy to have the overall conversation about costs and benefits and everything else. My only question is, given the open source libraries that are out there, given the underlying math, given the other underlying technical implementations, my sense is, I know you said you're not there yet. My sense is that I am there yet. And these are the same technologies, just to be clear, when you talk about end-to-end messaging, that the Department of Defense recommends that US soldiers abroad use to communicate with their families back at home.
Yeah, I get that. I get that. Let me add one more thing, and I don't want to hijack the conversation. Let me add one more thing, is that there is still, you're absolutely right that, you can go to GitHub and download the technology for creating end-to-end encryption, but there are still gatekeepers here, right? Because if you want that app to be used, there is still the Apple Store, there is still the Google Store where these apps have to be deployed. And those stores routinely ban apps that, for various types of reasons. So there's still a little bit of a gatekeeper there. It's not just, hey, I can deploy this and have a messaging with my friend. Like, there is still a barrier to entry here in terms of getting wide deployment. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. There are gatekeepers, and we can go back on this, but I do think we've identified the nub of the disagreement.
Okay, good.
I would also add, to this conversation, you mentioned, there are victims who are out there, and of course, from a parent's perspective of a child, whether they have been a victim or not, most likely would advocate for, yes, please, anything that will protect my child, please put it out there, regardless. So I'm curious to know, do those people then outweigh whatever other kind of conversation to be had when it comes to this subject matter, in saying that, yes, we want more and more protection?
I don't know. I don't know how to balance these things. And I can tell you, I'm not the right person to ask, because I have spent the last more than decade, talking to young victims of these crimes, and it is gut-wrenching. And it is heartbreaking, and it happens on a daily basis. And it absolutely, I will admit, colors the way I think about these issues in a way that makes me, I think, not particularly objective. And I think it's, I challenge anybody to go talk to some of these young victims and then take a strong position to counter what they say. But I don't think that's actually the right way to argue. I think we have to think more on balance, because John is absolutely right that there are benefits to this technology. And I don't know how to weigh those against some of the horrific things that are happening to kids around the world. I generally don't know how to weigh them.
Laura, do you have any comments on what we're talking about?
Nothing additive. More than sufficiently covered by my fellow panelists.
Well, then I'll get to kind of the final question for today. We've talked about Apple has proposed so much detection tech and all these different strategies, and we kind of come to this overarching question of, really, should we be leaving it to these tech companies to kind of determine how it is that our personal information and sensitive photos and things like that should be shared and scanned and detected and told to law enforcement or the government in some form? Or does it require external regulation by some sort of a government entity to then tell tech companies how they should be leading forward?
So I would say it should not be left strictly to tech companies. I think in an ideal world, Congress would be passing some sort of law about, not necessarily to say you have to use this technology or you have to scan in these ways, not that level of minutia, but this is the kind of personal data you should be collecting on people and should be able to provide to law enforcement upon legal request. One of the parts of my research that I've been doing over the past few months is that I've been talking to a lot of law enforcement officials around how they investigate and pursue these types of offenses. And one of the primary complaints that I've really heard from them is an inconsistency across the way companies handle this. So what they have basically said is that every tech company has a different policy for receiving legal process, which is to say subpoenas and search warrants. that they maintain different types of information about their users for different lengths of time. And when they make their initial tips to NCMEC, that they include different categories of information in those initial reports. That kind of knowing what to ask for, how to ask for it, when to ask for it, and how to frame it to which company at which time creates an enormous administrative burden for law enforcement officials investigating these sorts of offenses. And so when we talk about the fact that there are, over 20 million reports to NCMEC in a given year, that is itself a huge ask of law enforcement to investigate these offenses. And yes, some of them is old, repeated material, and we know who the victims are, and they're not being harmed, physically harmed anymore. But that's not always the case. And so anything we can do to alleviate some of the administrative pressure on law enforcement, I think, is to our societal benefit. And I think that having some sort of industry standard would be useful in terms of that type of thing. But like I said, I would not suggest that Congress get into the weeds about this technology in these ways and these circumstances. I think that's not going to be nimble enough, frankly, or agile enough, and would probably not keep up with technology in any meaningful sense.
And I open this up also to John and Hany for your thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would simply say I appreciate the frustrations that the law enforcement officials that Laura's been chatting with have. I think what's interesting as we talk about iterating on the existing system and on the existing framework is that some of those frustrations about inconsistency are actually features, not bugs, in the original implementation of how folks got companies to sign on to do this reporting at all. Right? By saying to folks, it's not going to be a prescriptive top-down reporting system. Yes, you can still have your own retention periods. You can still have your own stuff and still participate and still make reports. Yes, maybe you collect different information than your peer company, but as long as you provide account information to NCMEC, then in the report, that's okay. The question is, as this framework has evolved, is there an opportunity for standardization and normalization across those services now that we've onboarded folks over a decade plus? I think that's a really interesting question, but it's interesting to me, and I know you folks know the history of this, in terms of getting folks on board at all to do this reporting. There had to be a flexibility in order to do that, and maybe now comes the harmonization.
I'm not sure I like my choices. My choices between Facebook, Zuckerberg, or members of Congress to make sure we are safe. This is not a great choice. I think Laura got it right, though. And I think what we want is Congress to put guardrails. I don't think we want a highly prescripted, you must do A, B, C, D, E, F, G down to Z. But I think some guardrails would be good. I think for the last 20 years, there have been no guardrails, or very, very, very few. And I think we need to start putting in some guardrails around child safety, terrorism, disinformation, and all the various harm and privacy concerns that we have as well. I think we need to start putting in some guardrails. The thing that I worry about now is we already have virtual monopolies. We have a handful of companies out there that dominate, trillion-dollar companies that dominate. And one of the tricky things about regulating now is they are going to have a huge advantage over the new companies that are trying to come up with a regulatory landscape that the current giants of the tech industry didn't have to deal with. So we want to be very thoughtful that we don't start regulating in a way that stifles even more innovation than is already being stifled because of virtual monopolies. But I think if you look around the world, here in Capitol Hill, the UK, Brussels, Australia, Canada, everybody is trying to figure out how do we rein in the technology sector while to mitigate the harms that we've been talking about, while allowing for an open, free internet, and for the things, frankly, that we were promised 20 years ago, but that I think have not really delivered. The internet today is not the internet that I was promised 20 years ago. And I think I still, despite my frustration with the technology sector, I still think technology is a force for good, but I think we have to be more proactive in making sure that the harms are not outweighing the good parts right now, which I think is what's happening online right now.
Wow. Well, thank you all for a really, really interesting discussion. I can't believe it's already been an hour, and there's clearly so much more we could talk about. But I do want to get to some of the questions that the audience has submitted. We already have a good number. And so one of our first questions is talking about the detection technology, which is called NeuralHash. And they mentioned that it triggers a report once it's found 30 files in an event to attempt to reduce false positive, which is like saying you need to find 30 pieces of DNA at a real world crime scene before an investigation starts. So could there be an argument that this is overly cautious and NeuralHash should be more sensitive to detecting this type of content?
Yes, I was not a fan of that. I think Apple probably went too far there. Here's my guess. I don't know why they did that, but here's my guess. If you assume that every image you scan is independent of the next image, then the false alarm, let's say for a single image, is 1 in a million. Well, then the false alarm of 2 images is 1 in a million times 1 in a million. And the false alarm for 3 images is et cetera, et cetera. And so by the time you get to 30, it is an astronomically small number. And I think probably an absurdly small number. Just to give you some context, when we were developing PhotoDNA, our false alarm rate was on the order of 1 in 50 billion. So that means you'd have to see 50 billion images before you had a false flag. And please understand, when there's a false flag, people don't go to jail, right? It's just a human moderator steps in, looks at the image, and makes a determination. So it's not a huge lift. I think that was probably overly cautious, and I would like to see that number come down to a much more modest number, like 5, let's say. But the question is correct. Is like, you're basically giving people a buy for the first 30 pieces of CSAM, and that doesn't really sit very well with a lot of us, I think.
I'm guessing John and Laura, you agree from the vigorous head shaking I saw.
Yeah, I think also, I think, and I don't know that there are statistics on this one way or the other, but I think a lot of law enforcement officers who work on these sorts of investigations would tell you that it was just one piece of known imagery that resulted in them identifying an offender who was actively abusing children. And so, when you take that into account, and we're talking about live victims who are currently being harmed, I think setting that kind of threshold, as Hany said, is perhaps too much.
So I will jump in and agree to disagree on this one. So I was nodding vigorously because I agree with 99% of Hany's framing, and I agree with 99% of Laura's framing. Here's what I would flag. The idea that this gives a free pass to folks for their first 30 images, I get it. I completely get and understand the point, and I take the point, right? Should the number be 30? Should it be 5? Should it be 8? Should it be 12? Right? I think we should have a healthy conversation about that. And I think that conversation should be informed by data, right? The data from Laura's work about law enforcement officers who use a single piece of known CSAM to identify an active abuser. That should be taken into consideration. We should also take into consideration, though, what the spread of the data looks like when we have existing data on CSAM reports at companies who scan in the cloud today, right? What is the average number of offending CSAM photos or videos when a user is reported? Is it 1? Is it 100? Is it 1,000? Based on some conversations I've had with folks, those numbers tend to be really high. Folks tend to hoard this material, right? Now, I don't have a clear view into this. So I take Laura's research and her work with officers very seriously. And Laura says, well, 1 is often a key to cracking these cases. Fair enough, right? I would share one case that was out of Texas, in which a large cloud company, which scans its servers all the time using PhotoDNA to try to identify known CSAM. They are, a household name, for folks in the tech industry. They are a good actor in this world, and they make tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of reports every year. They made a report to a police department in Texas regarding a single piece of CSAM that was detected on an upload to their servers. The defendant in that case was a young man who stated he was in a video game chat on a well-known video game platform, and someone pasted a URL into the chat and said, go here for more texture packs and plugins for this game. He clicked on it, got an error page. Oh, interesting. Okay. Turns out that that error page was masking a surreptitious download of known CSAM. And that surreptitious download of known CSAM ended up in his downloads folder on his computer. And that downloads folder was set to automatically back up to the cloud. Everyone involved in this particular case agrees that it is a single piece of CSAM. That, as I said before, on a strict liability basis, this individual was no doubt in possession of unlawful material. But I think what Apple is trying to do is turn the dial a little bit to avoid situations like that, not to give this individual a pass, but to separate that situation from an individual who actively seeks out this material and downloads 5 or 15 or 50 or 500 pieces of it. So that's just to articulate a little bit of the balance where I think they're trying to get at here. If we had a law about CSAM, and I'm not recommending this at all, that had an intent requirement, I think Apple would be far less worried about the scenario I described. But since it's rightfully a strict liability regime, I think they're sensitive to that question of, should it be one or should it be more than one?
John is annoying me by being very thoughtful in his responses. I think that was an incredibly thoughtful and well-reasoned argument. And I think John is right. This should be a data-driven answer. All right. What are the worst actors and what are the false alarm rates to make sure that that 30 is the right number? And we just, I think we probably don't have the information, but I thought that was an incredibly thoughtful response.
Yeah, and one of our questions now also pivots a little bit. We have Apple that has come out with all of this tech and putting this forward. Thoughts now on whether and how Google for Android devices should respond to this problem on their platforms.
Yeah, here history may help a little bit. When we developed PhotoDNA back in 2008, 2009, it was only Microsoft that deployed, only. And then I think a year later, Facebook, and then a year later, it was, I don't remember if it was Twitter or somebody else. And it was the slow rollout over many, 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 many years. Because once the technology exists, and as John was saying earlier, once we know that it works and it doesn't lead to the types of harms that are predicted, there is going to be pressure on companies to deploy it. And I don't see that as a negative. I see that as a positive. And I do think there will be pressure for those using end-to-end encryption, whether it is just public pressure, shareholder pressure, regulatory pressure to deploy similar technologies once we know they work. And that's the way it should be. That's actually okay. That's good. And by the way, I'll say, if Apple decides not to deploy this in the next year or so, somebody else is going to do it. The technology, Apple did a very nice job. It's very clever, but we know how to do this. And other companies, I will tell you, are developing similar technologies, and it is going to be deployed. So I think it is just a matter of time. I don't think it's months, but I think over the coming years, this technology is going to get out there.
And Laura, there was a specific question on Android. Do you have a data point on Android or on Google?
Oh, with respect to their report numbers or?
Report numbers, PhotoDNA. I mean, the question was kind of about, Apple iOS is only one part of the ecosystem. What's going on in the other part? Is it a black box? Do we know things about it?
So in 2020, which is the year I cited the numbers for before, Google made just over 500,000 reports.
Yeah.
So order of magnitude more than what Apple had made.
Yeah. I'm asking not because I'm playing hide the ball, because you're the expert and I genuinely don't know. I know that they scan, right? And they scan server side. So they're different than Apple's approach here. And I think it's an interesting counterfactual. What if several months ago, Apple had merely come out and said, we have not built this on-device matching pre-upload regime. We are simply going to begin scanning iCloud in the same manner that Microsoft scans their cloud service, that Google scans Gmail, how is that received? What is that counterfactual? Because lots and lots of cloud storage companies and others use PhotoDNA and similar tools.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think there's probably a lot of hypothesis around why Apple chose to take the route it did, and I would not presume to speak on their behalf about why they went to on device rather than server side. But I do think that there is the argument, and I think that they would make the argument as well, that they were seeking to be more privacy protecting.
I think that's exactly right, Laura, is that if they did it server side, they would have to store the images unencrypted, and that's not good for anybody. So I also don't want to speak for Apple, but I think that that is a reasonable argument to be made.
And as we're, expanding this out to Google, and you had mentioned earlier even that there are live streams on Zoom. And so are we now potentially going into the realm of having a real-time CSAM detection on platforms, and what would that perhaps look like?
Yeah, this is something that I'm very worried about. So first of all, I started off the hour saying, detecting CSAM organically is very, very difficult. Doing it live is even harder, particularly given how many Zoom calls are going on any given day. I think that we are going to have to start getting serious about how live streaming services are being used, whether that's Discord or Zoom or Teams or Google Hangout or whatever it is. I have some thoughts on how to do that. I'll just mention them very briefly. I don't think it's going to happen by analyzing the video. It's just way too much data. It is way too hard. I think it's going to happen by analyzing the metadata in the chat room. The chat and when I have a faculty meeting with my colleagues here, the chat looks very different than a chat where there's a child being sexually assaulted. And that is a much smaller footprint, if you will. Now, look, huge privacy issues, right? So putting those aside for a minute, just from a technical perspective, there are things you can do in natural language processing that can analyze what is being said. And also, what's the metadata? Is this a call that is originating in the Philippines in the middle of the night and has people all around the world contributing? That looks very different than this type of webinar, for example, or my faculty meeting where all of the participants are geolocated. So I think there are things that could be done to protect children from live streaming abuse. Again, we have to balance the privacy issues and all those other things. But I think that we are going to have to get serious about that. And I'll also mention, I think we have to get serious about gaming platforms. Laura has mentioned sextorting. A lot of that is happening on the gaming platforms where kids and adults and predators are intermingling. Nobody knows who anybody is. So I think there are lots of threat vectors for kids online right now that we have to get serious about.
John or Laura, do you have any thoughts as well? Nope. Okay, well, I'll move on to our next question too, which kind of piggybacks off of this a little bit. Someone posed, would it be a better strategy for the big tech companies to analyze how criminals themselves are finding each other in the first place to distribute this content instead of trying to rely on the conversations? Like, is this a matter of state-of-the-art technology? Is there more difficulty in that, perhaps from the law enforcement perspective? And I open this up, obviously, to everybody to answer.
I actually don't have a great answer for this. I saw nobody else was jumping in for this, but
you were waiting for you, Laura.
Yeah, I was afraid of that. And I don't really have a good answer about why we wouldn't be looking necessarily at offender pattern behavior, other than to say that there is most people who trade in this material, I understand, have very specific preferences, but how they find each other, certainly they do use keywords, but they're tend to be a more tech savvy population. And so they tend to be people who quickly change when they realize that certain words are being tagged or being picked up by through different algorithms. They'll, insert an ampersand or something to change it. And they're quite evolved in that sense and quite agile to avoid detection. And so that is a very hard route. I will say that when we talk about adversary to adversarial or fully adversarial conversations, so I'm talking offender-defender trading content, really the only way I see forward in terms of identifying and detecting those is through undercover operations. of course, under lawful guidance, et cetera, all caveats applied. But I really think law enforcement undercover operations are really the way forward on that specific type of harm.
Great. So I'm going to just keep on going through because we just keep getting so many more questions as we're going through this. So somebody also posed more of like a legal question to this and said, I'm curious as to how Section 230 will play into all of this. Is it believed that Apple will be immune from what is found on their platforms due to this new tech, or will there be new exceptions that will be taken into account with the change?
I'll chime in a little bit here. So just to calibrate everybody, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act gives technology companies broad liability protection from both over moderation and under moderation. It is the gift of the gods to the technology sector. There has been for many years now lots and lots of conversations on Capitol Hill to everything from reform to eliminate Section 230. I don't know. I mean, I think what's hard to answer about this question is we don't really know what's going to happen to Section 230. I don't think anybody thinks it's going to be eliminated. I believe it'll be touched up a little bit to try to at least encourage better behavior when it comes to online harms. I think the answer to the question will depend on how 230 gets reformed. And I don't think we know the answer to that. I think there has been a lot of movement on Capitol Hill over the last few years on this, but while there is bipartisan frustration with the technology sector, there is not bipartisan support for what people are annoyed with the technology sector. So it's not clear where that reform is going right now, as far as I can tell.
That is totally fair. I think if there was an agreement, we probably would have had an answer quite some time ago.
Can I just jump in with one sentence?
Oh, for sure.
Sorry, I would be surprised and extremely disappointed to see 230 protections regarding over moderation be reduced. I think that at the end of the day, companies that are moderating, whether it's trying to keep CSAM content off their platforms or anything else, need to have some level of immunity here in order to incentivize them to continue, even if they catch some false positives up in that net. They need to be able to continue to do this good work. I would also refer you folks to Hany's great work, and also the work of Carrie Goldberg, who is an attorney up in New York City and has very specific and targeted Section 230 revision protections that are very victim focused, not just CSAM victims, but other victims of intimate privacy violations online. We at FPF don't take a position on particular bills or particular proposals, but many of the 230 proposals come from places other than a victim-focused lens, and Carrie's come from a place of a victim-focused lens, and I think that's laudatory and helpful.
Thank you. And so now I guess I'm going to go to what is a short question, but also a very loaded question of, are there specific alternatives that we could put forward to sort of advance CSAM detection and scanning and reporting? And I know Hany had mentioned earlier, what Apple has proposed is the bare minimum. So I'm really curious now as to what would be this ideal vision of detection of this kind of content from all of you.
Yeah, I'll add one thing here, and I appreciate the question. So everything we've been talking about are image-based. PhotoDNA is image-based. Apple's technology is image-based. We are blind to video. There is no fundamental reason from a technological perspective why we can't have a version of PhotoDNA that works on videos. There's lots of solutions out there. We have developed them in my lab. Thorne has a solution. Microsoft has a solution, but there is no unified industry standard the way we have with PhotoDNA. And the reason that matters is that if you don't have that centralized database from the trusted entity like the NCMECs of the world, it's not a very effective technology. So I would say the next bare minimum step is a video version. And the reason you want that, by the way, is when we developed PhotoDNA back in 2008, images dominated the landscape. Now it is videos. And so we need a video solution. I think we need better protections on gaming platforms where kids are being sextorted. Laura said at the beginning, there's lots of self-generated content and then sextortion that happens. A lot of that is happening on gaming platforms. And then I'll repeat the live video streams is the fourth part of that. Again, doesn't solve all the problems, but I think those are within our technological abilities. And again, balancing all the various issues that we have to balance, I think that would go a long way to protecting kids online.
Any other thoughts from John or Laura?
I would add to that. So I think all of that is correct, and I think the shift from image to video is something that's really important. And you can just look at the numbers. Video is dominating, so we really need some sort of standard across the industry to think about that. I would say too, though, that as technical as this problem is, there are a lot of non-technical solutions that can also be implemented and should be implemented alongside these technical options. So, before we were talking about, I mentioned education programming. That sounds really kind of touchy-feely and kind of nonsensy, but is extraordinarily useful. And letting kids know and how they understand and can feel empowered and have the agency to report this content and to feel safe doing it is, I think, an absolute necessity. And knowing that they, what it means to, if somebody's asking you for something you don't want to provide, and that you don't have to send it, and that, things like that, and just really kind of empowering children to have those kind of, that agency around those issues, I think is a necessary element. I also think that, again, we're talking quite US centric in all of this. I think that there are whole regions of the world that do not have the protections, infrastructure, law enforcement capabilities that we have in the United States. I think they need more resources as a general matter. They need more, they don't necessarily have a NCMEC to report this content. They're more likely to share it with other people to say, keep an eye out for this kind of bad behavior, because they don't have a safe place to report it. They need those kind of tip line infrastructures set up in those places. And we need supports for people who have been victimized so that they are more likely to come forward, helping to destigmatize some of the harms that they've experienced and make them feel comfortable to go to law enforcement or the service provider in the first instance and be able to say, I've been harmed in this way, et cetera, which is an extraordinarily underreported event in many instances. And so providing that kind of safety net so that people feel comfortable coming forward. I think there are a lot of non-technical solutions that should be coupled with the technical elements.
And just, I agree on both. Just very briefly, on the sextortion front, there is currently a very active debate right now between and amongst folks in the political realm, the policy realm, and the technical realm and the corporate realm about the degree of oversight that parents and other guardians are able to exercise over young people's devices. And for many years, that degree of oversight was essentially unlimited. There were technical tools that parents could use to monitor quite closely children's activities on iOS and on Android and on PC and on Macintoshes. And increasingly, for a lot of good reasons, there has been a nuanced conversation about the degree to which those same oversight tools can enable things like abusive monitoring in spousal relationships, or abusive parents to exercise more control over their children. And the trend over the past 5 years or so has been for tech companies to not eliminate, but to put guardrails and limits around parental monitoring. This is an extremely sophisticated conversation. It's extremely difficult, but it also has major implications for the sextortion back pattern that we discussed before.
I think that's, John, I think that's extremely insightful and absolutely necessary to reference. One of the initial elements of the iMessage feature that we've been discussing that Apple had rolled out was that if the user was under the age of 13, that if they chose to view or send the explicit image, their parent received a notification. That received a great deal of backlash from privacy advocates and others saying, what if this child is, in an abusive relationship with the parent, or is transgendered, or is whatever, or is whatever the case may be, the child deserves those kind of protections. And my initial thought when I read the plan for it as a parent, I was like, well, no, I should have full control over what what he views on his device. How dare you tell me that I shouldn't? And then I realized that I was being a little irrational, and I really needed to set my parenting ego aside and evaluate that, yes, although I believe that I have a very, very safe and good relationship with my child, that's not the case in many situations. And so I shouldn't let my perspective color the harms that could occur from that type of programming. So I just absolutely right. Thank you, John.
Well, I will say thank you again to all of our panelists. We have a few more minutes left, but definitely not enough to answer all of the questions that we've had. It's been such a joy to have you. And one of the comments in the chat was even that we should make this a weekly stream on video demand with all of us tackling different topics. So who knows, maybe we'll be back again on something else. But thank you again to all of our wonderful panelists. Thank you to the sponsors of this event, which is the Center for Security, Innovation, and Technology at the School of International Service, the Tech Law and Security Program at the Washington College of Law, and the Internet Governance Lab at the School of Communications. I'll say thank you once again to what was an amazing conversation. I really wish we could just keep talking and talking about this. Maybe not everybody wants to keep talking, but I would love to keep talking about this. But it was such a joy to have all of you. And thank you again to our audience for all of your wonderful questions. And I will say have a good afternoon to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Divya.